We're following through our series, looking at the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus' most famous of sermons. And we're not covering everything in this little series. And we get to a point today where Jesus rips in. There are so many things that Jesus says that are comforting and beautiful and challenging, aren't there? And there are some things that he says that you just hold your breath because he rips in. And this has a part of that this morning. So we're just covering through. And let's see what he has to say to us, his people, today. There's an American pastor who is known to a number of people in this church. He told of a story of this young gun guitarist, really good guitarist, who wanted to play in the worship band. And he was talented as a musician, playing lead guitar. And the pastor was excited to have him, come on board. He was excited to know that this guy wanted to play in the team and be a part of the worship band. But as a requirement of the worship team, the pastor had certain standards about character and motivation, and he wanted to just check this guy's motivation before playing, just to see, where his character was at, where his motivation was at for serving, because he was going to be serving in front of hundreds, if not more, people every week in that capacity as a guitarist. And so he auditioned him and found that he certainly could play. So he put him on the team on Sunday, but he said, "You're going to be playing unplugged. You're an electric guitarist, you're not going to be plugged in. So people won't hear you. I want you to play that way because I want you to be happy to play for God only. I want you to use all the skill that you've got and play with the team. They're going to be playing around you. They'll be heard so people can sing, but you won't be plugged in." The pastor said, "I want you to play for an audience of one, to make sure that you can do that with a whole heart. And then I'd love to see you be released to be able to play for a larger audience once I know you can play for one." He wanted this guy to be able to serve God with a pure heart rather than be upfront with a heart that was perhaps false. And he didn't just ask him to do that once. He asked him to do it for 6 months. And he did. And he enjoyed playing for an audience of one. No one else knew. And at the end of that time, the pastor had a beautiful conversation with him about where his heart was at, where his motivation was at. Some of us would think that's ridiculous. But the pastor had a pretty keen idea of what it was to serve, and he was desperate for this guy, talented, loves the Lord. He wanted to make sure that he was content to serve audience of one. That message, to serve for an audience of one, is where we're looking at today in this part of the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus starts talking about religious duties, things that are okay to do. Give, pray, fast, religious things that are part of the faith community of serving God, and yet we can do them for the wrong motivation. We can do the right thing for the wrong reason. And so Jesus has one of those tough things to say today in this message about our motivation. Why do we do some of the things that we do? Why do we do anything? Why do we go out and take selfies and wear certain clothes and be with certain people? Why do we do certain things in the Christian community? Jesus said sometimes the people of his day, even the religious leaders of his day, were doing things to be seen, not just to do them for God, but they were doing them to be seen by people and be applauded by people, be looked at with high regard from people. And Jesus was saying that's doing a good thing for the wrong reason, and you get nothing for that. So today is a little bit about motivations for what we do. And I'd encourage you just to be open and reflective to God about some of the things that we do. The Sermon on the Mount deals with motivations. Look at the very first verse of this reading. It's a warning. So we know something's coming in this passage when Jesus goes, "Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. Otherwise you have no reward with your Father in heaven." So he's already saying that doing things is cool. He's saying don't do it. He's saying it's not that we aren't to do anything. He's saying, hey, be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. No doubt for some of us, we might shrug it off, and sometimes I just shrug this off. No, that's not me, I'll go on to the next thing. I'm not a pretender, we might be mature in our faith. And yet, just the last couple of weeks as we've started this series and Darren's taken us through the Beatitudes, and we're looking at being poor in spirit. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn about their spiritual condition. We need God in our life. I'm broken. I'm not right without God. And I know that. Blessed are those who are humble. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst. And as particular as I've sat with that, I've been really open to say, well, Lord, what is it that you want me to learn about my own brokenness, my own poorness in spirit, and am I mourning about where I'm at with you? And it's been challenging and important and good. Because when we're satisfied with where we are in our spiritual lives, when we think, that's okay, that doesn't apply to me, I'm going on to deeper things, more important things. We may not say it like that, but sometimes we sort of have that sense. And we've got to be careful because Jesus uses a word a number of times in this passage, and it's the word hypocrisy. Don't be like the hypocrites. It's an ugly word. And he speaks very strongly about hypocritical living, about people that Jesus himself says, don't be like these hypocrites. Let's cut to the word itself. A hypocrite in Greek back then, a couple of thousand years ago, was an actor on stage who wore a mask, and they played a part. It wasn't them, but they put the mask on, and suddenly they were transformed. They were someone else. They were playing a king or a queen or a something, and the mask, that was an actor, and they were being a hypocrite. It was a positive sense. They were being someone else. But Jesus is saying, hey, don't put on a mask and be someone else, because what he was saying is that sometimes you're even masking your own darkness. You're trying to put a spiritual mask on. Look at what I'm doing before others. Giving, praying, fasting. He was saying you're putting up a mask and you're hiding sometimes your own darkness about this. And Jesus says some strong words about those he would call hypocrites. This is one towards the end of Matthew, chapter 23, verse 27. He said, woe to you, that's a strong saying too, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, they're some of the leaders in the Jewish community. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. You are like whitewashed tombs, which appear beautiful on the outside, but inside are full of the bones of the dead and every kind of impurity. Wow. In the same way, on the outside, you seem righteous to people, but inside you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. That's quite a vivid description, isn't it? Hey, brother, you're like a whitewashed tomb. Gee, thanks for that. But just, look good. You're looking good, clean, pure. And yet inside, it's like you take a lid off a tomb, no matter how nice that tomb is, and whoa, there's just death and deadness. Jesus calls it, doesn't he? These are religious leaders. And he's saying, you're hypocrites. You're playing a part, but that part is not what God wants. It's not just the Jewish religious leaders in Jesus' day that were guilty of this. Many people were also wanting to look good to others. And he's speaking to everyone in this sermon. He's speaking to many, the masses. And he's speaking to us right now today. So motivations, why we do certain things, is what Jesus is talking about. And it's what we need to just look at briefly this morning. They're very important to Jesus. Motivations are extremely important to Jesus. Not just what we do. I turn up and serve, or I do this or do that. It's not just that. It's why we do what we do. So the question is, who am I serving and why? And these activities are good and valid activities. He's not saying don't give and don't pray and don't fast in what we heard this morning in the text that was read. He's not saying don't do them. He's saying they're valid, and followers of Christ give to the needy, and we pray and we fast. We do those things, but Jesus is just saying be careful how you do them. So when we follow Jesus, his Spirit resides in us. Beautiful promise of a follower of Jesus. The Holy Spirit resides in us, and we undergo this lifelong transformation. We begin changing the moment we follow Jesus. We begin changing thoughts, attitudes, our behaviour. Things start to change. And this kingdom transformation produces an inner righteousness, a heart righteousness, and produces external acts of righteousness. Jesus says it in the first verse of this chapter. Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others. He's saying, do the acts of righteousness. That's what we do, because we're growing as people of God, but don't do them to be seen by others as something good and spiritual and mature. So we're actually designed to do these things. In Ephesians, Paul says that we're God's workmanship. We're God's beautiful workmanship, and that we were created for good deeds. We were created for acts of righteousness, to serve others, to serve God, to build up the body. Beautiful. But Jesus says, be careful why you do what you do. And so we're just going to look at the ones from Matthew 6 briefly this morning here, just in a little bit of overview, if you like. And they have to do initially with public worship. So this is stuff we do together: giving to the needy, praying, fasting. And then he goes on, I think, to help us understand perhaps how we can start to do those things with a pure heart and not be hypocritical about it. The thing about hypocrisy, it's very relevant for Australia. Mark McCrindle, some of you may have heard of him. He's a local Sydney guy, went to Morling College, he's been on TV, he's been on other things. He runs a social, not media group, but he does a lot of stats and things about social trends. You might have read some of his books on Gen Z and Gen Alpha and all these sort of things. Some of his work has indicated that the number one reason why most Aussies, everyday Aussies, don't come to church or are not interested to come to church. I've already sort of indicated where this is going to go, haven't I? But the number one reason they don't come is hypocrisy in the church. And it's a big figure. It's 50 or 60% of people don't come to church, or they're not interested to even pursue the things of God because of us. People in the church. It's the number one reason. There are other reasons, but that's significant, isn't it? It's at least significant to stop and have a think, and particularly today when Jesus says, be careful, the finger's this way, be careful, Neil, of doing what you do, because Jesus wants to know, why are you doing it? So this is relevant for Australian Christian life. It's relevant for our churches, that we be people who heed this warning. So he gives us three quick examples in our public worship. And he's saying when you give. So verses 2 to 4, I hope you've got a Bible in front of you. I haven't got the scriptures today up on the screen. So Matthew 6, he goes straight in after the warning, be careful, and then he says, so whenever you give to the poor, don't sound a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets, to be applauded by people. Truly, I tell you, they have their reward. But when you give to the poor, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret, and your Father who sees you in secret will reward you. The transformation that occurs in the heart of a disciple causes God's love to reside in us and causes us to love others like God does. And there's a saying about the poor in the Bible that God has a bias to the poor. Have you heard of it? God's bias for the poor. There are 2,000 verses that talk about those who are needy and God's people's response to them. Those who need justice, advocacy, those who need help, widows who need help with food, the poor who might need help in some way. There's over 2,000 verses that talk about God's heart for the poor. God is saying to us, if we know him and we know his love, we're going to be moved to walk alongside those who need help as well. And so as we start following Jesus, we start wanting to do what God does because he's changing us from the inside out. And what God is clearly on about is helping those who need help. And so our giving to the needy is very important. It's a natural outcome of God's work in our life. And Jesus reminds us here to give in secret, as it were. Don't go round getting applause from people for what we do. He says, then our reward will be from God, not man. It's not the same as our offering time here. We provide an offering time where you can go to the back and put in the box or click on a code, and that's public. This is public worship, and it's not quite the same. This would be more specifically, as God moves you to support people, just get on and support them. If you're aware of a cause, if you want to help those who might need help practically and personally, you can do something, go and do it. Absolutely. It's not unrelated to our giving here, but it's not quite the same. Don't forget, Jesus in Matthew 12 was standing at the treasury one day looking with his disciples around him. Public space, people were giving money to the temple in their offering for God. And do you remember the widow that came and gave 2 small coins? A couple of cents. And Jesus said she gave more than all the others. He was watching. He had to be looking, right? It was public. It was giving. That was giving to the temple, a bit different. And that was a public setting. But he knew her heart anyway, and she gave all that she had. Amazing. That's a little different. But in here, Jesus is saying, you're going to want to give to the poor. You're going to want to give to the needy because my Father in heaven loves that. And he'll cause you to want to do that too. But as you do it, don't do it to be seen by men, because then your reward's done. You'll get the reward. Nihil. Well done. Good stuff. You can be on the next mission board. That's it. That's your reward. Whereas God says, if you give in secret, if you give not wanting applause from people, God says, I see you. And your reward basically is eternal. It's a reward from God. Wow. That's pretty cool. From him. Giving. Then he moves into prayer in the next few verses. Now, some of you are going to be very disappointed. We're not going to do the Lord's Prayer here today. We haven't got time. That's worthy of a series in itself. The beautiful words of what we call the Lord's Prayer. Of course, Jesus never prayed it, did he? It wasn't a prayer he prayed because he talks about forgiving, for our sin, as it were. Well, Jesus didn't sin. It's not a prayer he prayed. It's a prayer he gave to us to pray. It's a prayer he gave the disciples as a model. Simple, beautiful, focusing on God, our Father who is in heaven. Holy be your name. And then goes through the providence of God. You are sovereign. You are over us. And yet, because of that, we do have needs. Lord, here's my need for today, my daily bread. Give us those needs. Protect us and keep us. It's a beautiful prayer. We can learn so much from it. Darren's series later, right? Just take it and do it. We won't have time today, but remember those things about it. But Jesus goes in verse 5, Matthew 6, whenever you pray, You must not be like the hypocrites. In each section he uses this word, hypocrites, because they love to pray, standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by people. Truly I tell you, they have their reward. Same thing. But when you pray, go into your private room, shut your door, pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. When you pray, don't babble like the Gentiles, since they imagine they'll be heard for their many words. Don't be like them, because your Father knows the things you need before you ask him. And then he says, verse 9, therefore, pray like this. And he gives us the beautiful Lord's Prayer. And so he goes from giving, a natural response of someone who's getting to know God, because God's heart is for the poor. Now he says it's going to be a natural response to outwork this beautiful intimacy that we can share with the Father by talking to him, by coming to our Father and talking to him and listening to him. And so prayer's a natural response. But Jesus again is saying it's natural, it's good, but be careful. Be careful what you want to do, why you want to do what you do in prayer. Jesus simply says, pray to your Father. Don't pray, as it were, before people to be seen. Doesn't mean you can't pray publicly in church. No, we have people this morning. Chris prayed this morning. Now we know and love Chris, and no doubt we know her heart, and I don't think she's up here to babble to get reward from you. I didn't ask you this before. I'm putting you on the spot. I shouldn't do that. But I know her heart, and we know. And in public worship, there's an opportunity to come and pray publicly before people. It's not the same situation as this in some ways, but we can pray in public, and we lead one another in prayer. And that's a good thing as we address God. But Jesus is simply saying, here's a beautiful form of intimacy between you and God, and don't sort of go on as if you're trying to impress people. Follow Jesus' instructions. Pray the beautiful prayer that he gives as a model. It's not meant to be just learnt as a parrot fashion and just said as is. It's a beautiful model, taking up those elements of our Father and his sovereignty and our submission to him and bringing our needs before him. It's a beautiful model. It's not meant to be parroted. But Jesus is saying, no matter what you do with prayer, just pray to God. Don't so much worry about the words. Don't try and do it so that people will hear you. He then quickly goes on to the next bit, fasting. And the same principles apply. Verse 16. He says, whenever you fast, don't be gloomy like the hypocrites. There it is again. For they make their faces unattractive so that their fasting is obvious to people. Truly I tell you, they have their reward. But when you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face so that your fasting isn't obvious to others, but to your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. So as we grow, the inner life of a disciple who's experienced humility and those things earlier in the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, the mourning, the humility, the brokenness, the poverty. There's an awareness of our own sinfulness and an awareness that we want God to move in our life and in the lives of others who need him. And so fasting is a way to do that with purpose and with intent. Fasting isn't that common these days among the church, but it's, as you have probably heard and may have done, it is